There is an uncomfortable truth that most people do not want to face. You can leave a narcissist's life completely, but that does not mean you disappear from their psychological structure. On the surface, they keep living. They have someone new. They post happy photos. They say familiar lines like, "I've moved on." But on a deeper level, where there is no stage, no audience, no performance, you are still there, not as a person, but as a standard. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They assume that if a narcissist remains obsessed, keeps comparing, or cannot fully settle with a new supply, it must mean love, regret, or that they have finally recognized your value. But from a depth psychological perspective, particularly in the work of Carl Jung, this is not a story about emotion. It is a story about structure. The psychological structure does not collapse when you leave. It simply reveals the emptiness that you had been unconsciously shielding for them. When you were there, the narcissist did not need to understand themselves. They did not need to self-regulate emotionally. They did not need to face their inner chaos. Because you were there, someone who reacted at the right moments, understood the rhythm, endured just enough. Someone sensitive enough to hold them, yet familiar enough not to threaten them. You were not just a relationship. You were a temporary point of balance for a system that never had a stable core. That is why the moment you leave does not create a loud ending. It is not when you cry, not when you argue, not when they discard you. It happens when you become unreachable. At that point, a silent transformation occurs. You are no longer an external object they can manipulate, but an internal image they cannot escape. You are no longer present, but you become the measure. From there on, every new relationship is placed under an invisible standard. No one is informed that this standard exists. The new supply has no idea they are being compared. But the narcissist feels the misalignment clearly, a reaction that is not deep enough, a silence that arrives at the wrong moment, an emotion that is either too much or too little. And the crucial part is this: they do not know why it feels wrong. They only know that it is not right the way it once was. That rightness does not carry your name, but it bears your imprint everywhere. This is why a narcissist can discard a new supply even when that person appears perfect on paper, not because the new person is lacking, but because they do not fit the structure you once held in place. And once that structure has existed, it cannot simply be replaced by another face. It can only be exposed as a growing emptiness, increasingly uncomfortable, increasingly suffocating, forcing them to keep moving in order to avoid it. What matters is this: you did not become the standard intentionally. You are not more valuable than others. You do not need to win against anyone. Becoming the standard is not a reward for sacrifice. It is the natural consequence of having been genuinely present within a system built on illusion. The narcissist is not stuck on you because they love you. They are stuck because with you they function more smoothly, and without you, reality began to surface. And this is the crucial point many people need to hear. Becoming the standard is not your victory. If you still need them to remember you, still need them to compare, still need their unrest in order to feel valuable, then you are still standing inside the shadow of the same old system. True freedom does not lie in being the standard in their mind. It lies in the moment that standard no longer defines who you are. This video is not written to make you hope that the narcissist will return. It is not meant to prove that you are more special than someone else. It exists to clarify a deeper truth. You did not leave to be remembered. You left so that a distorted system would no longer need you to keep it alive. And if they cannot escape the standard you unintentionally left behind, that is not your responsibility. It is simply a sign that you were once the only real thing in a world they built out of illusion. Part 1. The standard is not conscious. One of the biggest misunderstandings when observing a narcissist after you leave is the assumption that they are thinking about you in a conscious way that they are sitting there weighing, comparing, regretting, or quietly admitting she was better. But the deeper and colder truth is this: the narcissist does not know that they are comparing. There is no clear thought, no inner monologue, no moment of realization. There is only a vague, persistent discomfort, as if an internal system has lost a parameter whose name they do not know. From the perspective of Carl Jung, the forces that operate most powerfully in human psychological life do not reside at the level of consciousness, but within structures that have existed long enough to feel normal. When you were there, you were not registered as a special individual. You were registered as part of the operating mechanism. Like a heartbeat, or breathing only when it disappears, does the system go into error mode, without knowing exactly where the error lies. That is why, when a narcissist enters a new relationship, they do not enter it with the intention of comparing. They do not carry you with them as a concrete image. What they carry is a familiar sense of how things are supposed to function, a rhythm, a level of response, a degree of tolerance, a certain kind of silence. And when those elements fail to appear in the right place at the right time in the right dosage, they do not think this person is worse than the last one. They simply feel something is off. That feeling is difficult to name. It is not intense. It is not dramatic. It is not large enough to be called suffering, but it is constant, low-grade, persistent, and irritating. A conversation flows smoothly, yet leaves a strange aftertaste. A reaction seems reasonable, but does not provide the sense of being regulated the way it once did. Care is present, yet it exhausts rather than relieves. This is not an emotional problem. It is an operational malfunction. The crucial point to understand is this: a narcissist does not operate on the basis of deep emotion, but on the basis of controlling their internal state. When you were there, that system functioned smoothly, not because you made them happy, but because you helped them avoid feeling their inner chaos. You responded at the right moments to soothe them. You were silent at the right times so they were not overstimulated. You understood without forcing them to understand themselves. Over time, all of this crystallized into an unconscious standard, a baseline they never named, yet relied on to determine what felt acceptable. When that standard is no longer met, the narcissist does not feel sad. They feel misaligned, out of sync with the familiar sense of being in control, out of rhythm with what their nervous system has grown accustomed to. And because they lack the capacity for deep self-observation, they do not say, "Something inside me is unstable." Instead, they say or think, in simpler terms, "This relationship isn't right." This is why so many discards occur without drama. No major arguments, no obvious betrayal, no clear reason, just a cold, clean decision, sometimes even framed as an act of maturity. But beneath that decision is not a choice between two people. It is an attempt to restore a familiar internal state by removing what feels disruptive. The narcissist does not leave the new person to return to you. They leave because the system no longer runs smoothly and they are not conscious enough to understand why. This also explains why narcissists so rarely learn from subsequent relationships. If they do not recognize the problem as structural, they will continue to treat it as a surface-level error. If this person does not fit, replace them. If discomfort arises, seek new stimulation. If irritation increases, intensify control. Meanwhile, the unconscious standard continues to operate quietly, ensuring that each replacement brings shorter-lived, shallower, and less convincing relief. At this point, a very clear distinction is necessary to avoid illusion. Becoming the standard does not mean you are consciously idealized. The narcissist does not place you on a pedestal in their mind. On the contrary, you have been depersonalized at a deeper level. You became part of the system itself, no longer a person with history, emotion, or a personal narrative. That is precisely why they do not remember you romantically and why they cannot recreate the state the system once had when you were there. This is why the discomfort does not fade with time. It only changes form. At first, it is incompatibility, then boredom, then restlessness, then the need for stronger stimulation. But the core remains the same. The unconscious standard continues to operate unnamed and unacknowledged. And in their effort to avoid feeling this misalignment, the narcissist keeps moving from one person to another without ever truly stopping. The most important part for you, the one who left, is this. You do not need to do anything to maintain that position. The standard exists not because you remain present, but because you were present long enough and authentically enough to become an internal parameter. And precisely because the narcissist is not conscious of this, you are protected. If they were conscious, they would try to manipulate their way back in. But when everything operates at the unconscious level, you are no longer an accessible object, you are simply a discrepancy they cannot fix. This is not a story about being better than someone else. It is a story about a system that once depended on you to function and now must face the reality that not everything can be replaced with a new face. And in the next section, we will go deeper into a more specific question. Why the new person, no matter how hard they try, continues to feel off, even when the narcissist cannot explain why. Part 2. Why new supply always feels off. Once the unconscious standard has been established, what follows is not a clear comparison, nor an emotionally charged sense of regret. What emerges instead is a sequence of misaligned sensations that the narcissist cannot name. The new person does nothing overtly wrong. There is no betrayal, no lack of care, no obvious mistreatment. Yet, every interaction leaves behind a strange aftertaste, as if the internal gears no longer mesh. And what matters is this. The misalignment does not lie in morality or emotion, but in the rhythm of operation. The narcissist does not look at the new person and think, this one is worse than the last. What they register is that the sense of micro-control they once had is gone. When you were there, many things happened almost automatically. A glance was enough for you to know whether to remain silent or respond. A very subtle change in tone was enough for you to adjust your reaction. No explanations were needed, no requests were made, no instability had to be exposed. With the new person, everything feels rougher, slower, or else too fast. Some responses come too early. The new person answers while the narcissist has not yet stabilized internally. Attention arrives too soon, making them feel observed, pressured to respond, pulled into a rhythm they are not ready to control. Other responses arrive too late. A silence that lasts longer than expected, a delay that disrupts their sense of being the center of attention. In both cases, the problem is not the new person's behavior, but the loss of rhythm the narcissist is not accustomed to tolerating. Silence is a key point. With you, silence had structure. It served a regulatory function. You knew when to be silent so they could cool down, and when to speak so they would not fall into emptiness. The new person does not have that map. They either fear silence and try to fill it with questions, messages, or concentrated attention, or they are silent in a way that makes the narcissist feel abandoned, pushed out of the center. In both scenarios, silence is no longer stabilizing, it becomes a disruptive factor. Another element the narcissist is highly sensitive to, yet rarely acknowledges, is mood shift. Their emotional state changes rapidly, sometimes without a clear cause. When you were there, those shifts were caught at the right moment. You did not need to understand the reason. You only needed to adjust to the rhythm. The new person cannot do this immediately. They ask too many questions, or respond in the wrong tone, or appear confused. And each time this happens, the narcissist is forced into something deeply uncomfortable, having to feel their own internal changes instead of having them regulated from the outside. This does not produce immediate anger. The narcissist does not explode or lash out. What emerges instead is a subtle fatigue from having to explain, from having to conceal, from having to self-operate more than they are used to. This feeling is not labeled as disappointment or sadness. It is experienced simply as a growing heaviness, one that gradually leads them to withdraw emotionally, even while the relationship appears to continue on the surface. The crucial point to emphasize is this: the new person is not inadequate. In many cases, they are actually more stable, healthier, and more sincere. But it is precisely this that exposes the misalignment. They are not designed to serve as a regulatory function for a system without a stable core. They respond from their genuine emotional reality, not from the narcissist's unconscious needs. And in a system that has grown accustomed to being externally held, this sincerity becomes a source of tension. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the narcissist's persona begins to malfunction. The persona requires a familiar environment to maintain the illusion of control. When that environment shifts even slightly, the shadow begins to exert pressure from within. The narcissist does not recognize this as the shadow. They simply feel less comfortable in the new relationship. And because they lack the capacity for deep self-reflection, they seek to eliminate the source of discomfort rather than examine the structure that produces it. As a result, this sense of off does not fade with time. It accumulates. At first, it appears in isolated moments. Then it becomes a persistent background feeling. Eventually, the narcissist translates it into a simpler narrative. We're not compatible. The statement sounds normal, even reasonable. But beneath it lies not incompatibility between two people, but a lack of synchronization between an old system and a new environment. At a deeper level, each instance of the new person being out of rhythm unintentionally reactivates the unconscious standard that was previously formed, not as a specific memory of you, but as a felt sense that things once flowed more smoothly than this. And because that feeling is not attached to a name or a face, the narcissist cannot process it through dialogue or adjustment. They can only avoid it through action, withdrawal, seeking new stimulation, or ending the relationship. This section is essential for understanding why the narcissist's pattern of replacement tends to accelerate over time. Each new relationship fails, not only because of a lack of genuine connection, but because it repeatedly collides with an invisible standard that no one involved is consciously aware of. And in the next section, we will examine the behavioral consequence of this dynamic. Why discard in this context is not a deliberate choice, but an avoidance reflex aimed at restoring a lost sense of control. Part 3. Discard is an escape, not a choice. Discard is avoidance, not a choice. When the feeling of being off has settled into a background state, what happens next is often misunderstood as a deliberate decision. From the outside, people see the narcissist leave rather cleanly and assume they chose. But at a deeper level, discard is not a choice between two people. It is an escape reflex of a system that is losing control. The narcissist does not sit down to weigh pros and cons. They do not make comparison charts. They do not acknowledge failure. What happens is much faster. An internal jolt, when the familiar sense of regulation fails to return. When every interaction costs more energy than usual. When silence no longer soothes, but instead agitates. When mood shifts force them, if only briefly, to face themselves. At that point, discard appears as the simplest exit, a way to cut off the source of disturbance. What must be made clear is this: the narcissist does not discard because they hate the new person, nor do they discard because they love you. They discard because they cannot tolerate having to self-operate. Previously, their system relied on an external anchor to stay regulated. When that anchor disappears, they attempt to recreate a sense of stability by changing the environment. Discard, therefore, is regulatory, not moral. Through a Jungian lens, this is the moment when the persona begins to crack under pressure from the shadow. The persona requires a familiar environment to sustain the illusion of control. When that environment no longer delivers, the shadow generates discomfort, restlessness, and a pervasive sense that something is wrong, a feeling the narcissist cannot articulate. Rather than confronting the shadow, which would require self-reflection and psychological maturation, they change scenes. Discard is that scene change. This is why discard often arrives without drama. No climax is needed. No clear reason is required. Sometimes it is reduced to a vague, even mature-sounding ending. We are not compatible. But this statement does not describe the relationship. It describes the narcissist's internal state. Not compatible here means, my system no longer runs smoothly. The paradox is that discard does not bring lasting relief. It only reduces pressure temporarily. The problem is not the new person, but the unconscious standard that still exists. After discard, a sense of control may briefly return, especially if there is new stimulation, but it quickly dissolves when the familiar rhythm is not re-established. This is why discard cycles tend to shorten over time. Each act of avoidance only patches the surface. It never repairs the root. One crucial detail that prevents you from being pulled back into the spiral is understanding this. Discard is not a message directed at you. It does not speak to your value, nor does it prove who won or lost. It simply shows the narcissist fleeing from a sense of misalignment, a feeling that arises because the old structure is no longer being sustained as it once was. It is precisely here that many people fall into misinterpretation. They assume that if the narcissist discards the new person, it is a sign of returning. But discard does not move toward you. It moves away from truth. It is the narcissist's way of continuing to postpone the moment they would have to admit that not everyone can replace the regulatory role you once held, and that relying on such a role in the first place was an inherently fragile structure. Understanding discard as an avoidance reflex allows you to place yourself correctly, not at the center of the decision, not as the direct cause, and not in need of reaction. When you do not react, the avoidance cycle is forced to reveal its nature. Each change of scene only makes clearer the system's inability to self-stabilize. In the next section, we will follow what happens after, discard why the unconscious standard does not disappear but repeats itself, accelerating the cycle of replacement and deepening the sense of emptiness, a process that is not loud but steadily corrosive from within. Part 4. The loop begins. After discard, many people assume that everything is over. On the surface, there does appear to be a break. The new relationship ends, the story is closed with a neat explanation, and the narcissist quickly moves on to a different context. But at a deeper level, nothing truly ends. What begins instead is a loop, quiet, undramatic, yet increasingly constricting. The unconscious standard, which was formed earlier, does not disappear with the discarded relationship. It continues to exist as a background parameter, silently shaping every interaction that follows. And because it is not recognized, it cannot be adjusted. Each time the narcissist enters a new relationship, they carry the same unspoken expectation about how things should operate, an expectation no one is informed about and for which no one has a map. The first visible consequence is the shortening of the cycle. The initial phase, when everything is still new, when stimulation is strong enough to mask misalignment, happens more quickly and ends sooner. What once lasted for months now lasts only weeks. What once sustained interest now fades much faster. The narcissist does not label this as boredom. They simply sense that smooth functioning disappears earlier than expected. Alongside this comes a decreasing tolerance. Behaviors they once could overlook, a question asked at the wrong time, a silence that lasts too long, a reaction that feels too real now, become irritating more quickly. Not because the new person is worse, but because the narcissist's threshold has been eroded. Each failed loop further reduces their capacity to remain in a state that is not fully controlled. To compensate, the system turns towards stronger stimulation. Ordinary attention is no longer enough. They need intensity, more focus, more drama, more validation. This is not desire. It is an attempt to raise the stimulation curve high enough to temporarily override the expanding sense of emptiness. But intense stimulation works only briefly. When the effect wears off, the misalignment returns, this time faster. What makes this loop dangerous is the narcissist's own blindness to it. They do not understand why things aren't like before. They do not connect the dots across time. Each relationship is treated as an isolated case, with its own specific reason for ending. But because the cause lies in structure rather than circumstance, the outcome repeats with increasing steepness. Through a Jungian lens, this is a process in which the persona repeatedly attempts to reassert control while the shadow accumulates pressure. Each scene change rescues the persona for a moment, but the shadow is not integrated, it is only pushed back. And what is pushed back returns with greater force. The cycle, therefore, does not merely repeat, it accelerates. Viewed over time, a fairly consistent pattern emerges. Loop 1. New stimulation is strong enough. Misalignment appears late, discard is relatively smooth. Loop 2. Stimulation fades faster, misalignment appears earlier, discomfort is clearer, discard comes sooner. Loop 3. High stimulation is needed from the outset. Misalignment is almost immediate, emotional withdrawal. Clean discard. Subsequent loops. Cycles overlap, multiple sources are juggled. Inability to remain still, a persistent background emptiness. In each loop, the emptiness is not eliminated, it is merely postponed. And because postponement is achieved through stimulation, the system learns the wrong lesson. It comes to believe that the solution lies in increasing intensity rather than adjusting structure. This explains why, over time, the narcissist becomes more restless, less able to be alone, and more dependent on others' reactions, even while appearing fine on the outside. One subtle but crucial point must be emphasized. The stronger the unconscious standard, the more destructive the loop. Not because the standard is high, but because it cannot be sustainably met. Each time reality fails to match the standard, the system records another micro-failure. These failures are not consciously recognized, but they erode the capacity to trust stability, driving the narcissist into ever greater reliance on movement. And here lies a truth that is often overlooked. This loop does not require your participation to continue. It exists independently of your presence. Your leaving did not create the loop. It merely exposed a mechanism that was already operating. For this reason, observing the loop from a distance through stories, images, or accounts can easily lead you to believe that you still have influence. But that influence is no longer interaction. It is structural consequence. Part 5. Why this is not about you anymore. At this point, it is very easy for the listener, especially someone who once occupied your role, to fall into a subtle misunderstanding, believing that becoming the standard is a kind of delayed victory, a quiet recognition, or at least proof of personal worth. But if the story stops there, the entire process we have just analyzed is pulled back into the very system you already left. Because as long as the narrative still revolves around what you mean to the narcissist, you are still standing within their orbit. What needs to be reframed is this. Having once been the standard is not a title. It does not say that you are better than others. nor does it affirm that you deserve to be remembered. It points to a colder truth. You once held a role within a structure that could not stand on its own. And that role, no matter how central it was never the place you were meant to remain. If you look directly at the reality, you did not become the standard because you tried. It happened because you adapted. You learned to read the rhythm. You adjusted your responses. You endured misalignments that others could not tolerate, not because you were weak, but because you were sensitive enough to do so. Yet that very sensitivity, when placed inside a system without a stable core, was transformed into a regulatory resource, a function, rather than an equal relationship. So when you withdrew, what truly matters is not that the narcissist could not escape the standard, but that you stopped operating within a faulty structure. This is not your victory over them. It is the ending of a role. And every role, once it has fulfilled its survival function, must be released for a person to move into the next stage of psychological maturity. From Carl Jung's perspective, psychological growth does not come from being recognized, but from withdrawing energy from images that no longer serve the process of individuation. When you no longer need to know what the narcissist is thinking, whom they are comparing, or which loop they are repeating, it is a sign that your inner center has shifted. You no longer define yourself through the reactions of a distorted system. This is especially important in order to avoid a common trap in so-called empowerment narratives, turning the narcissist's collapse into fuel for the ego of the one who left. The truth is, if you need them to collapse in order to feel right, you are still waiting for their validation. And as long as that validation holds value, the story has not yet ended on your side. Healing is not standing on someone else's ruins. Healing is no longer standing in that dangerous territory at all. The fact that you were once the standard has only one meaning worth keeping. You withdrew in time. You did not stay long enough to be worn down to the point of losing your ability to sense misalignment. You did not try to fix a system that could not fix itself. You chose to stop participating when you realized the cost was no longer emotional, but existential, your identity itself. At that point, withdrawal was not escape, it was preservation. And when you truly separate yourself from this system, something important happens. The standard is no longer your story. Whether it continues to operate in the narcissist's life or not, it no longer consumes your energy. You do not need to track the loop. You do not need to wait for delayed recognition. And you do not need to occupy the role of the irreplaceable one in anyone's imagination. The freedom here is not emotionally explosive. It is very quiet. But that quiet is precisely the sign that you have stepped out of the orbit. The final section will take this one step further, beyond even the story of the standard. The moment when you no longer have any role within the narcissistic system, not because you were excluded, but because you are no longer participating. There, the story is no longer about them being unable to let go of you, but about you no longer needing any position in their world in order to live your life fully. Part 6. The final shift. From being a standard to having no role. There is a very quiet moment, rarely spoken about, because it does not deliver a sense of victory or satisfaction. There is no climax, no inner announcement that everything is done. Yet it is this moment that marks the true ending. It is when you realize that whether or not you are still a standard no longer matters. Not because you deny what once happened, but because it no longer relates to how you exist within your own inner life. At this stage, your attention no longer turns outward. You are no longer tracking which loop the narcissist is in, whom they are replacing, or how they are collapsing. Not because you are trying to appear unbothered, but because there is no longer any hook within you for that information to attach itself to. Their story, whether it continues or not, has moved out of the center of your inner world. And when that happens, the role of standard dissolves on its own, without denial, without declaration. In Carl Jung's understanding, this is the moment when the process of individuation completes an important cycle. Individuation is not about becoming special in the eyes of others. It is about reclaiming parts of the self that were dispersed into external images. When you were a standard, a portion of your life energy was invested in stabilizing another system. When you withdraw that energy, you do not become empty. You become self-referenced. Sovereignty, psychological sovereignty, appears very differently from what many people imagine. It is not loud, not sharp, and not in need of assertion. It is felt as the ability to remain in a neutral state without requiring stimulation. You do not need a story to sustain the feeling that you are alive. You do not need drama to feel valuable, and you do not need anyone to collapse in order to confirm that you were right. When those needs disappear, you enter a form of freedom that is not dependent. This is also where the concept of psychological adulthood becomes clear. Psychological maturity does not mean the absence of emotion. It means not allowing emotion to be driven by old structures. You can remember what happened without being pulled into explanatory loops. You can observe the narcissist's behavior without assigning it personal meaning. And most importantly, you no longer ask, "Why can't they get over me?" Because that question no longer contributes anything to your inner life. When there is no longer a role, you are no longer defined by the absence of that role. You are not the one who used to be the standard. You are simply a person living from your own center. New relationships, if they come, are not built on regulation or endurance, but on mutual presence. You do not need to read the rhythm in order to survive. You do not need to adjust yourself to keep a system from collapsing. You are allowed to be yourself, fully, without serving as an anchor for anyone else. Here, the story closes in a very quiet way. Not because everything has been resolved, but because there is nothing left to resolve. The narcissist may continue their loop. The unconscious standard may still operate in their life, but none of that pertains to your journey anymore. You have stepped off the stage not in flight, but in the posture of no longer being a character. And this is the deepest ending of all. Freedom does not come when they cannot forget you. Freedom comes when you no longer need to occupy any position in their mind. No victory, no title, just a very simple truth. You have matured to the point of having no role in a system that was never yours. If we look back over this entire journey, there is one point that is very easy to misunderstand. People often assume that the story ends when the narcissist can no longer escape you, when they repeat the cycle of replacement, or when their emptiness becomes increasingly visible. But that is not the ending. That is merely the point at which their story continues to run on its old momentum. The true ending lies elsewhere. The ending occurs when you no longer need to understand anything more about them in order to feel at peace. When you no longer use their repetition as evidence of your own worth. When you no longer track their collapse as a measure of having been right. In that moment, the story no longer revolves around the fact that you were once the standard. It centers on a simpler truth. You have withdrawn your energy from a structure that was never yours. In the spirit of Carl Jung, psychological maturity does not come from being mirrored, but from no longer needing mirroring in order to exist. Individuation is not about becoming a powerful image in someone else's mind. It is about returning to your own inner axis, where value does not require validation through anyone's obsession, comparison, or regret. The fact that you were once the standard reveals only one thing. You once carried a role that no one should have to carry for long. And the fact that you left in time reveals something far more important. You chose maturity over continued survival through adaptation. There is no winning or losing here, no one above or below, only a shift from a reactive life to a present one. So, if there is anything worth keeping from this story, it is not that the narcissist could not escape you. What is worth keeping is that you have escaped the need to exist in their mind in order to know who you are. When you no longer have a role, you are no longer bound. And when you are no longer bound, you enter a very quiet kind of freedom, but a very real one. This story does not end with their collapse. It ends with your full presence in your own life.